was one of America's most talented photographers, called by some the most significant photographer of the 1930s. Her pictures of the victims of the Great Depression were known for their emotional power and complexity. Some of these photographs, such as White Angel Breadline and Migrant Mother, which you will see during an in class activity, are among the era's most famous images. The grandchild of German immigrants, Dorothea Lange was born in Hoboken, New Jersey in 1985. She had one brother, Henry Martin, who was born when she was 6. In 1902, she contracted polio, which withered her lower right leg and caused her to walk with a permanent limp. After her father abandoned the family 5 years later, she spent the rest of youth living in her maternal grandmother's house with her mother and brother. She attended public school in New York City, where she began to take a great interest in the scenery of urban life. By the time she graduated from high school in 1913, she knew that she wanted to be a photographer. During the next several years, she learned about her chosen profession by working in portrait studios in New York. In addition, she took a photography class at Columbia University in 1917. In early 1918, she decided to travel around the world with a friend, supporting herself by selling her photographs. Shortly after the two friends arrived in San Francisco, however, they were robbed of all their money. She quickly found a job in a photo finishing shop. A year later, in 1919, she opened her own portrait studio, which soon became successful. She also married Maynard Dixon, an artist who was 20 years older than her. Together they had two sons, Daniel and John. Lange spent the next decade running her studio and caring for her children. Her career changed greatly, however, during the Great Depression. As the economic crisis grew worse, demand for her portraiture diminished and her portrait business shrank. In addition, she was disturbed by the poverty and desperation she saw daily through the windows of her studio. Lange said of that period, the difference between what I was working on in the printing frames and what was going on in the street was more than I could assimilate. Lange felt an urge to record some of the suffering that the Depression caused. Lange decided to close the studio and devote her efforts to photographing victims of the Depression. She began to photograph unemployed people and strikers on the streets of San Francisco. Many of the pictures she took were extremely powerful, conveying both the anguish and the dignity of their human subjects. In 1935, she was hired by the California State Emergency Relief Administration to photograph migrant farm workers throughout the state. Her work soon gained the attention of federal officials, and that year she became a photographer for the Federal Farm Security Administration, known as the FSA, which was a New Deal agency. She also divorced Dixon and married Paul Taylor, a bright young economist from Berkeley. The next 5 years were the most productive of Lange's professional life. With her husband, she journeyed 10,000 miles a year to document the plight of Americans affected by the Great Depression. She took photographs of every region of the country except New England, photographing rural people who were just some of the hardest. She took photographs of every region of the country except New England, photographing rural people who were some of the hardest hit victims of the Depression. Some of the subjects were Dust Bowl victims who had traveled to California in search of work. Others were Southern sharecroppers who tried desperately to try to make a living from their rented farms. Of her life on the road, Lange said, "We were staying out too long, working too hard. You were working in all kinds of weather and working in all kinds of heat. Bad beds, bad foods, and lots of travel." Lange's photographs of these people conveyed a sense of strength and honor that impressed many observers. At the same time, the photos were brutally honest in the way that they portrayed the human costs of the Depression. Despite the conditions, Lange's efforts paid off. Her pictures, packaged in reports for the FSA, informed government efforts to solve the economic crisis of the 1930s. In addition, her photographs were reprinted in newspapers throughout the country. The desperate scenes depicted in them helped move the nation to compassionate action on behalf of the poor. Lange's photographs of the breadlines, migrant labor camps, the unemployed, people on the move, the destitute, and the downtrodden have become a part of the nation's memory of the Great Depression. Lange left her New Deal job in 1940, and the following year she became the first woman to receive a Guggenheim Fellowship for Photography. In 1942, the War Relocation Authority hired her to photograph its internment of Japanese Americans in government camps. Lange opposed the internment and found the assignment to be one of the most difficult of her career. The pictures she took were later published in a book called Executive Order 9066. Lange's activity was slowed by illness after World War II. She completed several photo essays for Life magazine during the 1950s. In 1964, she was diagnosed with cancer. She died 1 year later at the age of 70.